Well, hello there, watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with the former Labour Special Advisor and columnist, Ayesha Hazarika, and the political editor of The Sun, Tom Newton-Dunn. Welcome to both of you.
Good evening.
No surprises, I think, on the lead for most of the newspapers, so let's take a look, shall we? The budget, of course, featuring widely. The Financial Times calls it a giveaway that was clouded by what might happen if there's no deal agreed with the EU when it's time for Britain to leave. The Times, too, claims that the Chancellor has delivered what it calls a giveaway budget, a gamble even. The Metro adopts a Halloween theme with the headline Tricks and Treats. The Guardian says the Chancellor has done his job, cut taxes and shored up the position of his embattled Prime Minister. The Telegraph reports that Mr Hammond has handed taxpayer Brexit onus by bringing forward tax cuts to end austerity. The Eye says the Chancellor has finally eased up on 8 years of financial squeeze. The Express says 32 million people will benefit from today's tax cuts. I think they're still coming in, some of those papers, aren't they? Well, let's talk more with Ayesha Hazarika and Tom Newton-Dunn. Do they like it, first of all?
They, the papers.
They, the papers, yeah.
I think they, the papers, are a little bit discombobulated. I'll tell you why. First of all, because the budget was begun at 3:30 this afternoon. The statement the Chancellor took to this much. Normally, Chancellors, and this is the nice times we've got used to, start their budget statements at 12:30. So all the papers had 3 hours less today to crunch one of the biggest red books, the budget books, any of us has ever seen. There were pages of this stuff, huge amounts of announcements, huge amounts of spendings, and quite a lot going on. No new, tricksy new schemes, no great big things to get our heads around, like a new idea, a new tax rise, or a new idea to take away pensions, tax relief, or something like that. But just an awful lot of spending based on an awful lot of revision to figures. And I think it was interesting, the mood in the House, actually. I was sitting in the gallery of the House of Commons as the Chancellor delivered all this. And the second reason why we're all discombobulated is the mood was a bit flat. Here we had a Chancellor of the Exchequer, a Tory Chancellor of the Exchequer, who prides himself on being called Fiscal Phil, Spreadsheet Phil, an obsession with detail, an absolute myopic desire to control public spending and the public finances, spending vast amounts of money, Gordon Brown fashion, getting the money in and then getting it straight out the door as fast as he humanly could. And I don't think Tory MPs, Labour MPs and journalists, we couldn't really believe what we were hearing. So hence I think that the reaction the newspapers are performing, certainly mine and others, is somewhat a state of shock.
But they said austerity was going to be over at the party conference. You kind of knew this was happening, didn't you?
Yeah, but previously Theresa May had said, well, look, we're going to spend all this more money on the NHS, and Philip Hammond spent the entire summer, including some of his own speech at the party conference a mere 3 weeks ago, saying, well, if you want more public spending, you're going to have to pay for it in higher taxes. There was some higher taxation and some stealth taxes on business today, but not a whiff of it. There was massive tax cuts, income tax cuts for average workers. So everything we'd heard over the summer just didn't really happen. Either we'd all been the victims of a giant spin operation and they were planning this all along, or, which I suspect more to be the case, is that this is all done rather on the hurry up to make Theresa May's conference speech all add up and actually to put out all those potential fires of rebellion that a minority government could face that could bring the whole thing down.
Yes, and interestingly, one of the banner headlines of the FT, which we're coming to in a minute, says that the dreaded words pension taxation, well, there it is up the top there, the dreaded words pension taxation were never even mentioned. That was the great fear, wasn't it, that he'd have to target his own supporters, effectively older people in this. But the good old days of Gordon Brown, it must make you feel nostalgic,
that's a big compliment coming from someone who's got such strong feelings about Gordon Brown.
It was a good thing.
But look, I think the politics behind this are absolutely fascinating, and I think a lot of it does go back to that really important conference speech that Theresa May made. Now, there is a slight difference in the semantics. She said austerity is over. He said austerity is kind of coming to an end at some point in the future, maybe quite soon. A couple of other interesting things. This increase in tax receipts meant that he had much more money to play with. And interestingly, in the past, normally a chancellor might want to hold on to that amount of money, save it for a rainy day, but he just went on a massive splurge in a kind of classic Gordon Brown way. And I think everybody, the Labour Party, I've spoken to a few kind of left-wing charities today and all that sort of thing, and I think everybody says that there was something that ticked a box in there. But I think one of the things that's fascinating is that what they picked up, and I think what Theresa May and possibly Philip Hammond, but I think she bounced him into this with her conference speech in terms of saying, look, austerity's over. She forced his hand to do this. I think they read the writing on the wall, which is, look, this country, if the Conservative Party is to survive, it needs something beyond Brexit to talk about. It can't just talk about tearing itself. It needs these other things, universal credit, you know, the national living wage, all these things. We need to show the country that we're more than just a party tearing itself apart over
But if you look
Brexit.
at the headlines, Brexit is still the elephant in the room, isn't it? There we go, the FT, Hammond's giveaway clouded by Brexit. And if we go to the Daily Telegraph, taxpayers handed a Brexit bonus. So a slightly different take entirely, almost, isn't it, in terms of the impact that Brexit might have on this budget.
You'd be mistaken in thinking that Fleet Street was as split as the country over whether Brexit's a good thing or a bad thing. The Daily Telegraph talk largely in their headline on this, the biggest rabbit of all in the Chancellor's jumbo-sized top hat of things he was pulling out of. We expected a few of these things to happen, some business rate relief for the high street, one other bits and bobs, some property reform in terms of the ability to build on high streets. We might have expected the massive amount of money poured back into universal credit because there was a few hints of that certainly on Sunday. What we didn't expect was the income tax cuts. Now, it's a Tory promise, a Tory manifesto of 2015, way back when in Osborne and Cameron's time, to increase the tax-free thresholds for the low rate up to 12,500 and for the high rate up to 50,000. Big income tax cuts for low-rate payers and even bigger cuts for high-rate payers. Now, that, although it was in the 2017 manifesto as well, we all kind of thought, well, we won't see that ever again. Brexit's coming along, it's going to make public finances very choppy, you can't rely on any of that. He did it, and he did it right at the very end. And it was almost the most silent moment of all. That's the moment where the whole House erupts. Remember that famous Nigel Lawson budget where he says in 1987, I think it was, I have nothing further to tell the House, pregnant pause, apart from an additional 1p off income tax. And it was the biggest, most famous budget moment of all time. All the benches erupt. That was Philip Hammond's moment this afternoon when he talked about the income tax thresholds. And there was confusion and near silence because people really couldn't see what was coming.
I think that income tax cut is very, very interesting because that that provides some red meat to all sides. That provides some red meat to his true blue Conservatives that say to be a Conservative is to cut taxes. This was in our manifesto.
For rich and for poor.
Although you could argue, given that we are still not, let's be honest, we're not through the woods in terms of the economy. The growth is still very, very sluggish. I think wages will still be
50 billion
for a
on
while.
servicing the debt, as we heard from the
Absolutely. But that was an interesting choice. So that, again, shows a sort of clear blue line. You get the impression that the Conservatives are trying to do two things. They're trying to sort of yield some to the Labour message, which is you need to feed public services more, but they're still giving a bit of red meat to their backbenchers, their Tory party grassroots members. But this is also a good dividing line for the Labour Party because the Labour Party can say, look, hang on a minute, you are giving away tax cuts to some of the richest people in society when, austerity is not over.
In terms of the Brexit point, why the Telegraph and the Financial Times have it so differently, the Telegraph is very pro-Brexit. They would very much like a Brexit dividend and for the country to have more money to spend and to keep in your pockets because of Brexit. The FT are the opposite. The FT say, well, actually, Brexit could ruin everything. And the truth is, if you go through the Office of Budget Responsibility's Blue Book, which is the independent forecaster telling you what's really behind all these complicated facts and figures and the spin that the politicians put on this stuff, the Chancellor's speech today, the OBR said in a very revealing paragraph, they said, we have no way whatsoever of being able to calculate what Brexit is going to do to the public finances. No way. Because we have no real idea what on earth this deal is going to look like. The best we can do is imagine things won't change very much and bet, and because it is still a bet, that we'll get a 2-year transition. In other words, things won't really change very much at all after Brexit. Now, things, certainly in the medium to long term, could change for the better, so the Brexiteers have it. But in the short term, especially if there's no deal and things are extremely chaotic in about 6 months' time, things could be considerably worse. And if they are worse, there will not be, and I can tell you this as a fact, there will not be the sort of money around to pay for this vast giveaway unless you want to borrow so much more money that the markets probably lose all faith whatsoever in the British government ever be able to repay them. And there's a general economic collapse.
Let's just go to The Guardian. I know you want to make a point on that, but delivered a budget of tax cuts and spending to shore up Theresa May, making the point, of course, that the minority government has to eventually please the punters, please the voters, I suppose. What about Jeremy Corbyn's response in the House of Commons? How did he do?
Well, I think it was a very tough gig. It's always a tough gig responding as the leader of the opposition. It's not the shadow chancellor, it's the leader of the opposition. First of all, you have the indignity where all the press lobby basically get up and leave the minute the chancellor has done a speech, because there's a big briefing that takes place. So then you often haven't seen the details of the speech. You've written a speech in advance, and then you're having to do stuff on the hoof. I think Corbyn very much went for old-time religion, which was saying, look, austerity isn't over, this is still broken promises. Look at, lots of the hardship.
Tax cuts for the rich.
Tax cuts for the rich. Remember, there's still, according to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, 14 million people trapped and locked in poverty in this country. So it allowed, he still went back to his traditional kind of script, if you like, for the many, not the few. But I think people were shocked at how much spending occurred. I think nobody quite imagined how much spending. Also about the choices. So, for example, a bit of money for schools. Schools have had a big squeeze on their budgets, but more money for potholes. So the Labour Party could define it saying, well, you think potholes are more important than our children's education. But
it's a top-up for education, isn't it? They got a massive chunk of budget.
But I think for extras, for a lot of parents, they've been very concerned about the fact they've been getting letters from their school saying, can we have money for school essentials? They don't see those as extras. So I think that the Labour message is still very much, all of this has a big Brexit cloud over it. Tax cuts for the rich. Do you really, really want to be giving away tax cuts to the rich when there's still a lot of people in poverty? Things like the universal credit was welcomed. However, there's still a big squeeze on working benefits, which is going to continue. So if you're, trapped in poverty, that's going to affect you. So there's still plenty of red lines for the Labour Party.
And our discussion on this and other things around today as well will continue after the break, including, has the budget helped households save money? Looking in more detail at that in just a moment. Well, welcome back. You're watching the press preview with me this evening, Tom Newton-Dunn and Ayesha Hazarika. Welcome back to both of you. So, tax cuts for 32 million is how the Daily Express sells this story. Daily Mail goes through some of the detail, doesn't it, in terms of who might gain. They're all doing the at a glance and umpteen pages. But will you be better off from next April? Is really the bit that everyone wants to know, isn't it?
How's this going to affect me? Which, quite rightly, you should be asking that question because we are all the taxpayers and they have our money, the government. Now, this was an easy one for the features writers. So us political people, we get to write all the stories about what he's done, and the poor old feature writers in the office have to beaver away and work out what these numbers mean for individual Joe blogs and Mrs blogs and baby blogs there.
The Staintons in this case.
The Staintons,
you'll find.
sorry, not the blogs. Well done you for reading it. Today it was easy because the answer was everybody gained. If you're in work, you gained, because the idea was there were to be no individual losers from this budget, both in terms of benefits claimants getting universal credit, the money that George Osborne took out of universal credit, almost all of it, though not quite, a large chunk of it was put back in by Philip Hammond, and of course these income tax cuts, very large income tax cuts. And of course the other thing we haven't mentioned is that for people on the minimum wage, their pay also went up because the Chancellor told individual companies that they will be paying people on the minimum wage £8.21 a year, I think it is, from next April, not £7.83, which it is now. So individual workers, if you're in work, which 32 million people in this country are, then you have done extremely well. Hence, it's just a case of filling in who gets what there. So you can see every single table there is in the plus, almost, apart from the odd zero, but there are no minuses whatsoever.
Although, just to put things in perspective, let's not go over the top about how brilliantly better off everybody's going to be. I mean, you talk about
Although, to be fair, single retired pensioners look like they're quite considerably better off, don't they? But anyway, do continue.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, but remember, I mean, people are still having a very, very hard time in this country. Wages have stagnated for a long time since the financial crash. The cost of living has gone up. Like I said before, 14 million people are living in poverty. What the TUC, which is the sort of chief kind of trade union organisation, sort of said, look, Britain still needs a bigger pay rise than they've got at the moment. So we talk about the national minimum wage going up to £8.21. A lot of campaigners say that actually it needs to be up at what's called a real living wage at about £8.75 and about £10.20 if you're in London. What a lot of people are saying, look, of course they'll be grateful for any small crumbs that they get, but life is still really, really tough for people. And also, just to be clear, there will still be cuts to other important government services. So yes, the NHS got a rise, but things like prisons will still have a cut. Local government will also still have cuts. Local government have taken an absolute hammering.
The Local Government Association seem to be suggesting that they've got quite a lot of money from it.
That's not necessarily so.
Small amount. They got a small amount of money compared to the historical level of the depth of cuts that they have faced since.
But they got it in multiple areas, didn't they? I think that's the
but there's still a lot of issues in terms
from
of
potholes to social
and also
care.
there's lots of still unprotected government departments, and they're not going to see a kind of a rise.
Well, what the Chancellor... So today wasn't the spending review. That happens next year, where the Chancellor sets the budgets for all different departments over 5 years. What he did say today is that some departments are going to get increases before the spending review in this year and next year. So defence, a bit more money on schools and an awful lot of money on health. What his argument is if Brexit goes well, every department could potentially get a spending rise. If it's just inflation plus real, in other words, they will get an actual rise in money, but not actually much once you take inflation away, or bigger is to be seen. The politics of this is really interesting. So the Tory right-wingers are almost as upset as Labour over this, because they rather like their fiscal rectitude and cutting deficits. What they don't like at all is throwing money, Labour-wise, Corbyn fashion, at the kitchen sink after this, in the hope you can compete with Corbyn, because you're always going to get outbid by him. You're
going to have to watch at 11:30. We haven't even started on the inside pages, and there's lots of it, isn't there? Ayesha, Tom, we will see you then. Thanks very much indeed. Here's the weather.